Hi everyone. Today I wanted to do a small response to what's happening in Kansas right now regarding the invalidation of trans drivers' licenses. And originally I wanted to do an essay response where I sit down, I write down my thoughts, and I talk about it more at length. However, it occurred to me that I've already essentially written about this before, specifically regarding the treatment of trans people in the past, notably Weimar Germany, and the treatment of the Berlin whores under Hitler's rule. And I talk about the treatment of trans people alongside the treatment of sex workers. And being that I'm trans and a sex worker, and intersectionality is a huge part of what I do, that essay examines a lot of those things in ways that feel relevant to what's happening in Kansas right now. So I'll read the small update in regards to what's happening in Kansas, talk about it in lieu of everything that has come before, which I'll summarize, and then discuss my own thoughts and feelings vis-a-vis my research into the horrors of Weimar and how that applies to what's happening in America and Kansas in 2026. And then lastly, I'll sort of close the video out with some extra thoughts and feelings just in regards to the trans struggle, how it ties to the struggle of other minorities under the United States is an empire in decline, basically. And an empire in decline, on one hand, will try and scapegoat people at home, smack down dissidents in preparation for war abroad. And that is something that happened in the 1930s, and it is something that is happening approaching the 2030s. So basically, a century apart, what happened in Nazi Germany is something that echoes or rhymes in America. So I'll talk about some of that a little bit at the end. First and foremost, Laura Jadid writes, "It seems all Kansas-issued trans driver's licenses are invalid effective tomorrow. It is now illegal for trans people to drive a car until they surrender their license at a DMV that most will need to drive to and have it reissued with the wrong gender marker. This was never about women's sports." And they are responding to, "Kansas sends drivers to trans people demanding the immediate surrender of driver's licenses. The legislature did not include a grace period." From AaronInTheMorning.com. Laura Jadid's post responding to that article being on 2:01 a.m., February 26, 2026. So this is happening after the implementation of many of Project 2025's desired goals, bills, what have you, and all of those were happening following up or through with a variety of anti-trans legislation that was being passed throughout the nation during Biden's administration. So in times of state crisis, any progressive elements that protect various minorities, including people in the queer community more broadly, will be dialed back. You see this under the current administration. You saw it in Soviet Russia, and you saw it in Weimar Germany, where there were various progressive elements at play politically that were dialed back with the rise of fascism defending capital. So in Nazi Germany in 1933, Hitler comes to power, and then in 1934, various laws were passed to basically punch down heteronormatively against so-called degenerates. And the National Socialist Party, also known as the Nazis, issued those laws in defense of the nuclear model and capital dressed up in socialist language. In Soviet Russia, you had a similar thing occur where Hitler and Stalin, courting each other, issued similar laws. In 1933, you had the burning of the books of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology. A lot of the famous book burning photographs are specifically of that event. Then in 1934, Stalin and company in the Soviet Union recriminalized homosexuality, and this targeted homosexual men, but also queer women, and it would have affected people who are trans, because you have to keep in mind that in the eyes of bigoted people, Stalin, Hitler, and those extending from them into a national politic, aren't really going to be able to make the distinction between, oh, I'm not a homosexual man, I'm non-binary, or I'm trans. Gender non-conforming in some shape or form, they would have seen respectively within their national politics as degenerate as of the West, while at the same time conservatively dialing back the rights of these groups to defend the state, to defend the nuclear model. So the same thing that happened historically in those places also would happen in the United States under the present state of affairs. Various battles for queer rights in the 1960s would lead to various concessions from the state and would lead to various successes. And those successes led to the passing of laws that guaranteed certain rights, generally under a homonormative scheme, where the more you presented as of the in-group, that Pete Buttigieg kind of queer would basically be allowed to exist closer to the in-group, provided that, they made a certain amount of money, that they were white, middle class, and they adhered to the nuclear model. They got comfortable and they assimilated, essentially. So these concessions were generally made similar to, say, the feminists of the early 1900s would have been afforded certain rights if they were white, middle class, and cis. So fascism and moderacy through Western liberal values, courting fascism and defending capital, would historically afford rights to marginalized people who were closer to the in-group. So you would see this with feminists, for instance, where the first wave, second wave feminists were, generally speaking, white, straight, middle-class women, and they would exclude a wide variety of other people from the outset. And as time went on, there would be various civil rights struggles in the 1960s that would lead to a changing of strategy to make a cunning recognition of various rights within these further marginalized groups that would be afforded, provided that they themselves assimilated. So you see this with like the LGBA, for instance, where you would have essentially a tokenizing, a gentrification and tokenization of various cis queer people, for example, and they would find themselves in a situation where they had more rights, but they were still expected to toe the line. And in times of crisis, you see that with the TERFs, for example, where they defend their rights in the midst of state decay by punching down against people more marginalized than them. And you see cis queer people, male or female, punching down against trans rights. And in times of crisis, after the Cold War and the so-called end of history, and the United States, Pax Americana more broadly on the global stage, empire, after a brief success period, enters very quickly into a state of decline, of decay. This is by design, mind you. This isn't some accident. It has to. It has to recede territory in order to reclaim it again, because it has to move money through nature. That's how profit occurs. So if it just owns everything, it can't continue partaking in the process of capital, because capital is a back and forth process. So it has to decay. There has to, furthermore, be an enemy, a scapegoat, someone to blame. Capital rapes by design. And in order for it to do that, there must be someone for them to scapegoat, someone for them to blame. The Nazis and the Soviets did it against queer people in the 1930s, for example, and we see the same thing happening barely a century apart in America, entering a state of decay. As far as that goes, you see this punching down from feminists, from Marxist-Leninists, and various other people who aren't trans, who look the other way in light of the decay of various rights from these assimilated groups, who then tokenize, and in defense of these rights that are being basically put on the table on the chopping block, they will punch down against trans people who, by and large, were seldom given the same degree of success and put automatically into the crosshairs. And this is something that we have to keep in mind, is that trans rights have been fought for throughout the years, and us struggling to be recognized at all and to be given the same degree of privileges that cis queer people have been given, for instance, has always been an uphill battle and has never entered the same degree of assimilated status. Instead, we've always been on the outside. We've always been demonized. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, various stories would be presented in ways that, while they were homophobic, they would also be transphobic, ambiphobic, and intermissic in terms of all of these gender non-conforming groups, where if you weren't homonormative or you weren't binormative, so the idea that, okay, you're a cis queer person, either homosexual or bisexual, you would be expected to punch down against these other queer groups who are more marginalized than you are, who are gender non-conforming, and who aren't, transmed or biologically essentialist, that kind of thing. So the fact that trans people have always been scapegoated and marginalized more than cis queer people is something that is coming to a head under the present state of affairs, nearly 100 years after Hitler's rise to power. We see a similar rise of fascism under Pax Americana in the United States and elsewhere, mind you. But in the United States, there are a passing of many laws that are effectively attacking groups adjacent to these cis queer assimilated parties. And they see, okay, we're going after these people, and if you don't want us to do the same to you, you better punch down against them. It's Holocaust politics, where those who aren't at the front of the line are expected to throw those in the front into the furnace, lest they be thrown into the furnace first. And it's just a sad reality, but it's the kind of thing that happens all the time. When the state needs someone to be sacrificed, you have a preferential chain of mistreatment. And those with more privilege will betray out of convenience and desperation to betray those with less privilege, or those who aren't currently being attacked will betray those who are currently being attacked or selected for termination by the state. And while I wish I could say that people would do the right thing, they don't always. And historically, instead, what happens is they will oftentimes betray those who are effectively in the same boat as them, just in a different part of the boat. But they are both under the purview of state power in ways where, as the state routinely enters crisis, it will seek someone to scapegoat and to try and avoid being terminated themselves. Those more gentrified, more assimilated, will punch down against those who are currently experiencing the state's ire. This happens by design. So, keeping all of that in mind, what's happening right now is an ongoing thing. And in the 2020s, various rights that were made by trans people, insofar as we were at the very least allowed to exist in public, and the rising of attention through the late aughts and the 2010s into the 2020s, were victories of sorts, in that we began to exist in the public eye. And then suddenly, as the state enters crisis, routinely, I might add, there is a demand to silence these voices and to say, oh, well, there's only so many voices that can be given the microphone, and in a very Lord of the Flies kind of way, only cis queer people can hold the conch. Meanwhile, the entire island is on fire and burning to the ground. So, in light of the rise of Gamergate and Trump and the TERFs and various other reactionary tokenized forms of feminism, queerness, and ethnic minorities, etc., who are more than comfortable punching down against trans people, who can be of any ethnicity, of various religions. They can be indigenous, disabled, what have you. Trans people and other gender nonconforming parties found themselves on the receiving end of marginalized violence, divide and conquer, if you will. And at the same time, you had various people in positions of power who were queer, who would basically compromise with the state and help facilitate the passing of various laws that, if they wouldn't directly target cis queer people, would target trans people. So either they were helping directly assist in that, or they weren't resisting the passing of these laws. And we're talking hundreds of bills throughout the nation that were put before the representatives and governments of the state and the federal and so local, state, and federal levels were passing all of these different laws targeting trans people. And this was something that was going on into COVID and the early 2020s, where there were suddenly just hundreds of bills that were being passed, that were being funded. And then furthermore, on top of, Gamergate and the electing of Trump, of Biden, of Trump being elected again, there was a constant drive to scapegoat and demonize trans people that was had by various token parties. And the Epstein files on top of all of that, wherein the funding of all of this was bankrolled by billionaires, the bourgeoisie, in ways that would affect all of these other groups and spaces that I mentioned. So this is a long time coming, and this is the tip of the iceberg, if you will. So what's happening in Kansas is just a glacial push that is accelerating under fascism. And that is something that doesn't just include white, straight people. It includes a variety of other people, marginalized people, who have helped punch down against trans people. And keeping all of that in mind, I want to respond to the post by Jadid and Aaron in the morning with an essay. And this essay is one where I give my own thoughts and feelings on what is happening now versus what happened in the past, insofar as you had a rise to power of fascist politicians, and those fascist politicians were aided by people who weren't fascist, who were moderates, who were liberals, who were even in some cases progressive. And in those circumstances, people in Weimar were betrayed by members of their own communities or allies adjacent to their communities in the same city. And Weimar has always been sort of a focal point for these types of struggles. And in the research that I do, I have acknowledged that the treatment of sex workers and the treatment of queer people isn't so cut and dry insofar as you can have sex workers who are more progressive, and you can have queer people who are gender nonconforming or not. And this leads to various degrees of assimilation, of betrayal. So keeping all of what I just explained in mind, we have what I wrote here, which again is from an older essay that tracks with what's happening currently in regards to assimilation and betrayal under the present state of affairs under Pax Americana. I write, Kansas echoes Weimar. In 1933, Hitler assumes power, driving Berlin's horrors underground before sacking Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology. But even Hirschfeld devalued transfolk, an abject trend romanced in bourgeois ways by future scholars like Jill Smith. And I go on to provide 4 screen caps from my essay, Whores, Heart Attacks, and Those Who Cause Them Are Reversing Abjection to Find Joy Under Fascism, which I wrote July 13, 2025. And I'm just going to read these one at a time. The exact books and their respective acquisitions led me to reading a bit while at the hospital, and gave me food for thought about my own work in relation to other workers, e.g. Smith's Berlin Coquette, as something to synthesize, i.e. in the aforementioned old-fashioned way of looking at something and going from there, i.e. from grad school onwards, leasing the approach from my pre-internet past, as a little girl reading books from the local library in my spare time. Books are brain food. I see food, I eat it, with people being food as much as books, as are all the assorted neo-medieval hyphenations Gothic typically affords. This time I read Smith's concept of a whore's ball, i.e. as advertised by West Berlin media in 1988, but also her academic desire to view whores in ways that defy common expectations about whores. What will the world come to if we can no longer tell who's a whore and who isn't? Re, the abjection process. This book is much like The Whore's Ball, for it provides its readers with images of prostitutes in Berlin that defy common stereotypes about deviance and destitution. It does so, however, by examining debates on prostitution that took place up to a century before the women of Hydra organized their first ball. Some artists and writers who lived and worked in the German capital at the time were able to see beyond dichotomized images of prostitutes and envision them as something other than victims or villains. Granted, some of Berlin's most iconic cultural texts serve up visions of female monstrosity and victimization that are impossible to erase from our index, without ignoring those images of Berlin's metropolitan decadence and sexual murder. This book shows that the idea of prostitutes as rational worker and elegant bourgeois coquetten, also surfaced and took hold during this period, and gave us a far more complex, differentiated picture of gender and sexuality in modern Berlin. My work disrupts the dichotomized reading of prostitutes as either victims or agents of destruction reproduced in existing scholarship. Re creates the monstrous feminine, which, much like the Taz's article about the whore's ball, perpetuates stereotypes of prostitutes and produces narratives laden with judgment that do an injustice to the very context they are describing, analyses that view prostitution only through the restrictive dual lens of destitution and sexual deviance lead to less nuanced readings of primary sources. Unquote. Source: Introduction to Berlin Coquette. And yet, in reading it, I suddenly felt personally attacked. i.e. by a fellow academic, woman, discounting my profession and research areas, i.e. not just Metroidvania, but the Gothic, monstrous feminine, ludogothic BDSM, and public nudism, exhibiting sex and force. An explanation eluded me, save that I wanted to lash out at this stuffy German prude. Bitch, please. Keeping that in mind, Smith comes across a bit stuffy and classist in my opinion, but also achingly nostalgic for a before time. Stuck in a frozen past versus a plastic one, she fleeces herself while covering up, i.e. by conveying a pick-me mentality despite various concessions I more or less agree with, e.g., there is no doubt that prostitutes are paradoxical figures, for they can represent both the affirmation and the subversion of social structures. As public women who sell their bodies in a market dominated by male buyers, prostitutes seem to reinforce patriarchal capitalism, yet they can also be seen as exploitive workers and potential revolutionaries. RE Introduction. She's so close, yet disturbingly myopic, similar to Holocaust media focusing on Jews alone, versus the entirety of the victims affected by Western greed run amok, e.g. the Silence Equals Death Project from 1987 onwards. The point here is that upon reading Smith et al., I immediately thought of my own approach towards reversing abjection, i.e. as challenging her biological emphasis that furthers abjection, i.e. to stop that by leading into various expectations concerning whores, deliberately subverting monstrous feminine language to defy the usual benefactors, which includes the middle class. I thus found Smith and I coming at the same problem from vastly different vantage points, and at times cross purposes. Her from pre-World War II Berlin, and I from Metroidvania and Amazons, and the present space and time, regarding media orbiting real events that Metroidvania concern on and off stage. Smith, the straight Gen X academic, born in 1972, according to her book, focusing worryingly on women with disturbingly white, cis, and middle-class flavors versus my trans-millennials work, born in 1986, expanding the scope of worker liberation to not turn my nose up at such matters, i.e. whores are monsters of a polity of marginalities, not white German women alone. Furthermore, Gothic shows how history goes beyond real cities, the political reality of trans people and other minorities taking class war and its cultural and racial intersections to half-real territories, re Metroidvania in my case, that Smith shies away from, despite the book title, i.e. mostly relegating her analysis to oil paintings, e.g. Kirchner's 1914 Friedrichstrasse, above. Instead of the usual reindeer games, Smith gushes about Berlin and its bourgeois whores, who look normal, re. not like whores. I see her and respond, much in the same I did while learning about Marx's homophobia in 2024, re. making Marx gay, or Magnus Hirschfeld's devaluing of androgynes in 2025. By the fin de cycle, the androgyne was perceived as a monster of sexual and moral ambiguity, often identified with other outsiders such as masochists, sadists, homosexuals, and lesbians. Eventually, even Magnus Hirschfeld, the sexologist who defended male homosexuals, lesbians, and transvestites, condemned the androgyne for its supposed lack of harmony. Greeks and Romans had thought androgynes beautiful, but modern scientists could no longer agree. They were now perceived as misshapen freaks. True, there were those who tried to revive the older image of the androgyne as a symbol of perfect harmony in order to defend homosexuals. For them, the tender youth with girlish body and male genitals provided a corrective to aggressively masculine symbols of power. But in general, the distinction between normal and abnormal held, and the androgyne as a biological monster was allowed no happy ending. Respectability had to be fortified to resist the onslaught of those who were rediscovering their bodies and attacking dominant manners and morals. Unquote. Source, Nationalism and Sexuality, 1985. The crux for this regression is always bourgeois, and bourgeois is the very adjective Smith assigns, i.e. to her object of study, whores, while alienating her readers from the very alien things demanding reclamation, also whores, are nudity and whorish, monstrous feminine signifiers. The question asked by Hydra's whores, though somewhat tongue-in-cheek, still capitalist realist in my opinion. Respectability is a charnel house, one in which the very coquettes from Smith's research were buried alive. Silence is genocide, which we must camp by giving voice to the unspeakable. in a world where all workers are whores under capital, albeit to different degrees and flavors of exploitation. RE Thesis Statement 2023. Kill your darlings, you have only to lose your chains. To that, cops are undercover, as Samus is. But so are all whores, a process of concealment and code that Jill Smith, probably unaware of cryptonymy and abjection, still calls a whore's ball. RE, the 1988 Hydra event in West Berlin, a place that defies expectations, but specifically what whores should look like. RE, not like whores, but gentrified in ways I would argue that historically decay into the very monsters capital cages and kettles mid-abjection. What do you think the crooked cross was? A censor merging corporation and state to bottle Pandora by gagging her and slicing off her head. Abjection from the start. Intent doesn't matter, outcomes do. The fact remains, whores can be cops, including false rebels of the fascist sort. They can also be functional rebels of a proletarian sort, moving power anisotropically towards workers and away from the state. RE, flow of power determines function, not aesthetics. Abjection, a two-way street. So while Smith writes about disrupting discussions of prostitutes, moving them away from sexual deviancy and destitution, choosing to focus on assimilation via bourgeois prostitutes she calls, among other things, coquettes. The fact remains that queer folk and other minorities don't have the luxury of mere segregation. We can look like angels in the streets and act like freaks in the sheets, and having a historical understanding of that exact effect in Berlin while America operates like the Fourth Reich remains useful. But I would also stress how cryptonymy affords a reversal of Smith's argument, freaks in the streets and angels in the sheets, or just freaks wherever. So, again, these are conversations where you have people, historians, who are looking at Germany in 2013 in Jill Smith's case, and explaining how, oh, well, if you just look at it from the language of monsters, it reduces people to something undesirable. But this unto itself is kind of whorephobic and transphobic, because much of the whore's power stems from reversing the abjection process. It's like giving the Gorgon a haircut. And furthermore, ignoring the reality that trans people can't just assimilate, because to do that is, by its very nature, destroying what we are. It is completing the genocide. It's not initiating it, it is completing it. And that is something that Jill Smith, as someone who writes about sex workers in Weimar, if you were to apply their research now to what's happening in America, it would effectively be calling for the castration of, the abjectioning of trans people in ways that would complete the genocide. The problem is that it won't stop there, because the moment that you start to assimilate, that you start to appear as not just a whore, but also not just a trans person that is basically a whore in the eyes of the public, a succubus, a witch, criminal, what have you. This is only the beginning. So what's happening in Kansas echoes Weimar as it happened in the 1930s, where you have the demand under state crisis to gradually rescind the rights of someone closer to the margins. An act that would be facilitated, lubricated, not just by politicians, but also scholars who turn a blind eye to the very things that we have to reclaim. We can't just mask ourselves in ways that hide what we are, because to do that in public and to disappear from public life means that we will only be exploited after we have segregated. Segregation is no defense, and silence is genocide. We can't afford to gag ourselves, because doing so doesn't restore some degree of respectability, because the more that we assimilate and disappear, we don't just erase who we are, but we will be policed under a perpetual state of surveillance, the panopticon, and you will have different people where they start measuring skulls, where they start looking under people's dresses, pulling down their underwear and inspecting their genitals. And this will not end at the forcing of people to change their gender and their sex on a driver's license. This is the beginning of something that will only get worse. And point in fact, what happened to the whores of Weimar is they were killed because Smith was pointing out, well, look at them, look at these bourgeois coquettes and how they navigated the situation in Weimar. It ultimately didn't do them any good because sexuality was outlawed leading up to Hitler's rise to power. Hitler assumes power. This specific image here, D.G. Hewitt's 17 Reasons Why Germany's Weimar Republic Was a Party Lover's Paradise, after the rise of Hitler to power, the whores of Weimar and all the maneuverings that they did as bourgeois coquettes was for naught. So they would have had to have stopped Hitler's rise to power. They would have had to have blended in, because not blended in. They would have had to have stuck out and communicated very publicly by blowing the whistle, because segregation for them was no defense. Because what happened to the whores of Weimar? What happened to Weimar? It became fascist. It didn't disappear, it just became fascist. And then it melted down, and the whores of Weimar were all but destroyed. Obviously, Germany survived, but at what cost? Keeping quiet leading up to Hitler's rise of power did not do them any good. And that is my strongest critique that I can offer of Jill Smith, is that they are not only abjecting trans people and sex workers who don't conform to heteronormative standards under a fascist state, but she is overlooking the reality that her own approach is a deeply flawed one that overlooks the reality of what happened to the whores of Weimar, and by extension, the queer people of Weimar. They were shipped off to concentration camps, regardless if they blended in or not. If you do what the state says, it's still going to kill you. That's my argument against Smith's approach, but also pointing out that they are furthering the abjection process by insisting that whores segregate themselves, that they operate in ways that ultimately do them a disservice. We have to fight the state actively. We can't just blend in. Obviously, there's a strategic element at play, and the cryptonomy process is one where we show and hide at the same time. And yeah, sure, you can wear masks, you can blend in part of the time, but ultimately we have to be visible. The paradox of exposure demands it. We can't just be quiet. We can't just hide all of the time. We have to speak out in ways that bring these concerns into the public eye to see the light of day. And that includes in the language of monsters, of Creed's monstrous feminine, of Amazons, of Gorgons. You can't just give the Gorgon a haircut and have her present as bourgeois, as cultured. You have to become unruly. Peace is a white man's word, and peace and blending in, gentrification is ultimately what Smith was describing. And the moment the state entered crisis, those women were fucked, and those they betrayed in the process were also fucked. And Jill Smith and her arguments are fucked, and the people that she betrayed are currently on the chopping block in ways where her arguments, I would argue, aren't really that useful. So that's something that I wanted to keep in mind. There are more comments that I have in the thread of this particular post that I released on the same day, where I talk about what's going on, and I describe how Jill Smith doesn't really seem to understand how sex work functions between people who are seen normally as monsters. So, and if you're called a slur, or if you're devalued, you have to reclaim that. You can't just become something else, because then all the bully has to do is call you a name, and then if you change what you are in terms of how you identify, how you label, how you exist in public, you are effectively closeting yourself. And yeah, this is just food for thought. In light of everything that's happening in Kansas, This is just a continuation of the things that I've been writing about. And this isn't just in Kansas and Michigan. They're trying to pass a law that would make it illegal for trans people to exist online. They would be seen as inherently pornographic, and they would have to disappear from the internet, to disappear from public view. And to give in to that would effectively be to lean into Jill Smith's arguments. Oh, don't worry, we're bourgeois. We appear a particular way, and look at that. It's providing nuance to the discussion by not leaning into deviancy and destitution. Did it ever occur to Jill Smith that maybe deviancy and destitution describe the social and material realities that trans people exist under, and sex workers more broadly? And it's not just assigning punishment to us, but giving a description of the very realities that are historically materially unfolding over and over under state models? Gee, I wonder. So that's just my food for thought as this situation unfolds. We are, as trans people, targets of the state in ways that cis women, politicians, scholars have ignored and are willing to throw under the bus in a variety of ways, reactionary or moderate. And no matter how pretty Smith's words sound, it is ultimately a death sentence to try and blend in. You can blend in the short term, sure, but you actually have to resist what's happening. You have to challenge the state. You have to challenge fascism in ways that do not afford the state an homeless child, a scapegoat. There can be no scapegoats. You can't scapegoat capital. You can't give it what it wants. In The Babadook with Jennifer Kent, you can give me the boy. Give me the boy and I'll go away. That's not how this works. If you give the abuser someone to abuse, it's going to demand more and more and more. That's how abusers work, and the state is the ultimate abuser. It happened in Weimar, and it's been happening in the United States since its inception. The United States is a police state. It's a settler colony. And it has been abusing different groups since its inception. It's built on that. It demands sacrifice. Not just the blood of patriots on the altar of freedom, but indigenous populations whose land was stolen by the colonists initially, and then after they began to enact settler colonialism to a national degree from Jefferson onwards, it began to expand and take more and more and more and push indigenous peoples into concentration camps. And even if they tried to gentrify, tried to follow American laws, they would ultimately be betrayed. The Navajo, I believe, tried that, but then they found gold where they were, and then they were basically denied the very rights that they had agreed to. The treaties that they made with the white man were reneged by the colonizer. Go figure. I am altering the conditions of our agreement. Pray I do not alter them further. This deal is getting worse all the time. Yeah, because colonizers are bad actors. The state is a structure of invasion. It has to invade because that's how capital occurs. And then it's going to invade not just once, but over and over. After all the Native Americans are either dead, gone, or controlled in situations, where they are put into a status of cunning recognition, where congratulations, you have representation from the reservations, but you are basically stuck there to be abused. Invasion, look at all this land that's suddenly occupied by different people. The state will take the colonizer or a member of the privileged group, and any rights that they have been given, either through the Bill of Rights or the civil rights for people of color, for people of gender nonconforming status, their rights will be dialed back. And then those closer to the in-group within the middle class will be expected to take a loyalty test. Throw this person in the oven, or we'll throw you into the oven. And this is a constant demand. Capital will routinely invade its own territories after it acquires them. It will then invent a new enemy, and a new enemy, and a new enemy, and it will decay and fall apart. It will come together and fall apart over and over. And this is just a continuation of that. It is something that indigenous people have experienced since the inception of the United States. It is something that diasporic slaves from Africa have experienced since the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, into the formation of the United States after the Civil War and Jim Crow, following the Civil Rights Movement. Just because it says that they're equal on paper doesn't mean that they're treated as equals in the eyes of the law, and they're still expected to do their own loyalty tests. And that's where you get tokenization. That's where you get gentrification. You get black excellence. And this happens with queer people as well, especially cis queer people, but also plenty of gender nonconforming people will betray their own. As someone who writes about this constantly, you get people who are turfs and swerves. You get Marxist-Leninists who punch down against us through Stalinist rhetoric. There are plenty of different ways that betrayal occurs, but capital demands all of this, and it encourages it through entropy and division as part of the structure of invasion. Invasion must happen, division must occur, and people must be betrayed. People must be exploited by the state. The state rapes by design. Profit and productivity through capital/state models demand abjection to occur so that profit can happen, productivity can happen. It's just how it functions. There's an engine and there's fuel, and that fuel is exploitation. And this is something that we have to challenge ourselves, and we can't be silent. The paradox is, the more that we give the state, the more it will take. That's how rapists operate. That's how domestic abusers operate. That's how cops operate. They betray by design. And they do this through intersections of class, culture, and race. And unfortunately, trans people are like, hey, look, we're in the middle of our own genocide, and you could help stop it. And all we can do is fight to get other people to see us as human, as worthy of standing together with, because they'll be coming after us just as they're coming after immigrants. The two have been happening at the same time, and trans people have always been enemies in the eyes of the state, even before the language existed, and it was just like sodomy is something that people would be basically pilloried under through sodoming laws, put in pillories and humiliated in public, killed in prisons through gross displays of state power, of police brutality. This is something that's been happening under modern states since they have existed. Nation states have always had this type of device, and it only became more active. The more the capital established a bourgeois foothold, the more these laws came into practice, not out. E.g. vampires. The late 1700s into the early 1800s, the love that dare not speak its name, as Dale Townsend explained to me, became the love that wouldn't shut up. And from 1870 onwards, Foucault's A History of Sexuality, you had the recognition of the homosexual man as a separate species, one subject to judicial review, that was built atop the ancient canonical codes into capital and the rise of the bourgeoisie, and a demanding of abjection to be furthered through the Protestant ethic into late-stage capitalism. And all of these betrayals as empire, through capital, decays under Pax Americana. So right now, this is happening with trans people in ways where we have to raise awareness, and we can't do that from positions of segregation, of silence. We can't afford to be silent. And we need the help of other people, scholars, politicians, academics, our fellow workers, to speak out for us, to speak out for those in Kansas and elsewhere in the United States, but also around the world, in the Global South included. Because trans people, for instance, exist all around the world. Two-spirit people and similar arrangements of gender nonconformity have existed since the dawn of time in indigenous cultures. So this is nothing new, but the way that it's unfolding now is something that needs to be made aware of in the eyes of the public. Turning a blind eye towards us is to also turn a blind eye towards immigrants and various other peoples who are being affected, to turn a blind eye towards intersections of these things. Furthermore, you have trans people of color, you have indigenous trans people or two-spirit people, you have white middle-class trans people like me, who are trying to sound the alarm from positions of relative privilege, where I use my platform and my website and my research and the people that I work with to try and combat these problems. It's happening in Kansas and elsewhere. It's not just one particular place. It's all around the nation, and it's all around the world through a particular model of domination that is centuries old and is entering a state of decay that demands that we, alongside immigrants, be sacrificed. This isn't going to stop. This is a situation where we're in the hiding phase, where people are hiding trans people, are moving them to safer territories, are helping feed them and provide mutual aid. And this isn't going to stop unless there is a change in policy, unless society stops turning a blind eye and recognizes who the real threat is, not trans people, but the state. I think I'll cut myself off there. You get the point. Thank you for listening. If you like the content that I make, you can like, share, and subscribe. You can also fund the work that I do on Ko-fi or Patreon. The link tree is in the description of this video. Thanks again for everything. Leaving comments, doing anything else like that. Any bit of awareness at this point helps, because we are currently under attack. Some people are under attack more immediately in Kansas as opposed to where I live, but also the place where I live is also subject to federal invasion and the facilitation of said invasion by state and local powers. So this is something where I need your help, and those who I work with and know need your help. Don't ignore us, because sooner or later the state will come for you as well. Solidarity, comrades, and stay safe out there.